Welcome and welcome back to the Marketing Made Inclusive podcast. I have an amazing guest for you this week. I know I do say that every week, but I genuinely mean it because we've been exploring inclusive design, and I just wanted to bring on the person who introduced me to the whole genre topic itself. Errol Fox. Please tell our listeners and viewers a little bit about yourself.
Oh, wow. A little bit about myself. Hi, I'm Errol Fox. My pronouns are they, them, but I use a lot of different pronouns now. So you can't really get it wrong with me, is often I say. Uh, but I'm a good person to practice your they, thems with. Um, I I've been doing design in big design, non-like in the terms of like designers, all the things that I've been doing design for like 12 years, which basically means that I never like particularly specialized in any one thing. I sort of stayed a generalist, you could say, on a lot of different ways. But in these days, I work at an organization called Superbloom. Superbloom is a design NGO nonprofit that works globally and works predominantly on tools and technologies from the design side of things for human rights activists or for internet shutdowns, basically anything that is a technology that is trying to make the world a better place, or as much of a better place as can be possible. That is where I earn my money. The other place where I earn my money at the moment is doing a PhD at Newcastle University, which is to do with design and to do with human rights and humanitarian work, but also to do with open source software. So the other thing that I get real nerdy about, as well as inclusivity, design, human rights, is open source software, which is, if you're not familiar with it, you've probably used some open source software, because a lot of the open internet is based and founded on open source software. So that's a little bit about me. Anything else you want me to cover?
So many things, so many
Okay.
things.
Yeah.
But as soon as you were going through, I was like, oh, we worked together in this bit and that bit.
Mhm,
Did we do
mhm.
anything for WordPress, or am I imagining that one?
For the organization WordPress?
No, the meetup group Bristol WordPress. Did we ever?
Oh gosh, I feel like maybe at one point I went to a meetup, or maybe like there was a panel or something like that, but I don't remember specifically what it was, but I feel it sounds like plausible, if you know what I mean.
Yeah,
It
our
sounds,
paths have crossed many times in the work.
it has.
But I'm trying to also remember when I met you, and it's been a while. It would have been like 2018, 17 times.
Yeah, for sure. It was we were both in a community group about people trying to make their way in technology, marginalized folks making their way in technology. And that I joined that group shortly after I moved back to Bristol. So it must have been like maybe, yeah, 2017, I want to say, is probably the latest that it would have been.
Oh, wow. I have fond memories of knowing you. Well, you're not going anywhere,
Oh,
but
yeah, I think one of the first conversations we had was about like Sailor Moon and anime. Like, where do we go to find other people that like nerdy things, but are also kind of chill about the nerdy things, if you
yeah,
know what I mean?
not super intense. Like,
Yeah.
and I think one of the first questions I remember asking you probably was what is design? Because I think I did the
Mm,
typical marketeer thing, and I was just like, isn't it just graphic design?
mm,
And then we had a good conversation. You told me, no, it's not just that. There's so many layers to it. So,
mm,
two questions.
mm.
We're on the Marketing Made Inclusive podcast. What does inclusive marketing mean to you? And then second question is, what is design?
Oh gosh. First question, what is inclusive marketing to me? I think inclusive marketing isn't necessarily about trying to be, and I think I learned this from you mostly, is not trying to be like the most, we have included every single kind of person under the sun in every minutia possible, but that you are being honest about how you are marketing. You are being as honest as possible, as upfront with the user or customer, or however you refer to the humans existing in the world as possible. And that you make like honest and concentrated efforts to notice who is using your stuff or buying your stuff, and that you don't ignore them, and that you reflect that like reality back at the world. And I think that's the thing that often companies or people think is the hardest thing, is like, well, we have all these people using the tool that we didn't think used the tool or something like that, and but how do we find them, and how do we put them forward, and how do we essentially like use them? And I think that that's kind of where the tension comes, is like maybe they don't want to be used, maybe, anyway, it's kind of, it's tricky, but like, yeah, predominantly honesty and upfrontness with what's going on is what I
Mm.
would say inclusive marketing is.
I really like that, the honesty and upfrontness, because sometimes people using it don't want to be spotlighted, and that's fine.
Right, it might actually be like dangerous for them to be spotlighted as well, given the work that I do. A lot of the stuff that I've learned since my first few steps into like inclusive design is about the human rights angle of things, essentially. And yeah, a lot of the time we don't realize who we're putting at risk by accessing or talking to. And often a lot of people globally are very, uh, what's the, like agreeable, or very almost like
Mm.
excited sometimes about the things that they're using that help them in a lot of ways. Like we definitely find in the human rights technology space that people are like, if something works for them, they're very like pleased and engaged to like contribute to it. But we have to be really careful that we're not putting those people at risk by like highlighting them or using them as a case study, or all those kinds of things. So it's tricky.
Hmm.
But your second question, what is
What is
design?
design? Yes.
Wow. Um, as a person that started a PhD, I could give like the like most boring I read a book answer, but I'm not going to. Um, I feel there's two answers to this part of this question. I think two hopefully short answers. The first thing about design that I think is important is that it isn't necessarily, we don't you don't necessarily think of it as in terms of like an output. Often we think of design as a thing that has been created and crafted and made and designed. So you can
Mm.
think of like objects, or you can think about experiences, or you can think about services or technology. But the part of design that is harder to articulate and harder to often realize is the aspect of like facilitation and the bringing together of all the different perspectives in order to design. So when I talk to people about what is the role of a designer within the task of designing, it's to understand,
Mm.
it's to some extent translate and transform into something that then makes sense for all the different people involved in that use of that thing, that object or experience. So design in some ways is facilitation or
Hmm.
conversation, collaboration, ways in which to engage with people and the world. Um, um, and it's you could also say the second part of the answer is like that it's a process.
Mm.
Um, it's a process to come to the whatever the meaning of optimum, or whatever the meaning of best is to you and your team or your tool or your domain, is the quote unquote final thing that gets used, or the thing that is in the public or accessible. Final is a weird word because nothing is ever final. Everything's always changing, evolving, kind of getting sunsetted, getting
Hmm.
revived, all that kind of stuff. So final um, in this way of describing it is the thing that is accessed at
Mm.
any given time.
Thing that's
Um,
engaged with.
yeah, it's kind of, I guess, not necessarily what people think of when they think about design. They think about like things you can see,
Mm-hmm.
um, uh, or things, yeah, the visual components of something is what people see, and I think that that's a symptom of the to some extent the exclusivity, so the non-inclusivity of design as a practice. So
Mm,
design historically is very like elitist, very
mm-hmm.
colonial, very like Western in how it's done and approached. Like a lot of the ways that we get taught how to design are very private, but you access people to extract information from them as
Mm-hmm.
opposed to involve them in the process. There are lots of um, experiments with how to do like different ways of designing with people, but ultimately design is still like having a lot of trouble trying to be non-extractive. Um, but yeah, it's very opaque. Like a regular person, if you told them that you're a designer, they wouldn't necessarily know what goes into that process because it's intentionally, like, I think,
They're
been
not able to see that.
built that way. Yeah.
I think it's really beautiful the way you described it as the translation, because that, I think, for me is where I connected after meeting you about the depths of design. Because
Mm.
being a marketer and coming from social media marketing, we probably don't pay design as much respect because we see it as a tool to a means and we have to get something out quickly. We're normally burdened with some kind of design work, but we don't really know that we're doing it because we have to get
Mm-hmm.
this out, we have to do this. And there's so many things that when I started talking to you more about design, I was like, oh, I do that. I try to understand an audience. I try to do this. And then there's the physical elements of it. Like I didn't realize how much spatial awareness I had until I see this is a small thing, but I see an Instagram post and I'm just like, that's off. And I can't
Mm.
say why it's off. Or
Mm-hmm.
someone, we did an audit for a client recently, and they had their social icons at the top of their web page, but in front of their menu. And it
Mm-hmm.
just made my body itch because I'm like, that's off. Why is it these things? And I just didn't relate to how much humanness is in the whole process of understanding why things should be the way they are and the
Mm-hmm.
understanding of figuring out why people want things in those places and laid out in those
Mm-hmm.
ways. Um, but I'm curious to know, so you've had an amazing and long career in design. At what point was inclusive design integrated into that, or you were made aware of it?
Interesting. Yeah, I one of the well, the first conference talk that I started doing about the work that I did was about diversity and inclusion in design. And I don't really give that talk anymore, mostly because a lot of the examples that are in it are from old workplaces, or actually a lot of things have improved since I was giving that talk.
Yay to
So while
improvement.
right, yeah, I know. It's really it's good to see. Um, and also I am tired of talking about diversity and inclusion. I am very tired of being invited to talk about that as my like subject, even though you know the spiel,
Mhm.
very supportive of diversity and inclusion, but we should absolutely not be making people talk about it when they want to talk about other things.
Yep, when they want to talk about
Um,
their skills and expertise, please do not invite me to your conference to solely talk about diversity. I want to talk about
oh,
marketing. I want to talk about AI. I want to talk about the things I'm
right.
nerdy about. They might have a sprinkling of D&I in it, but yeah,
Yeah.
it's a whole separate
Yeah,
rant. But yes, you were saying.
absolutely a separate rant. But the way that you asked the question is interesting because when did it start coming into my work? I think it started coming into my work a lot later than I when I realized it was a problem. So I started realizing that design and non-inclusive design was present when I started my career. And I started my career in like 2010, 2011, in kind of .coms and kind of website, back when website designer was still a job title. And I guess like even sort of back then UX design, user experience design, was something that not a lot of people still had that title. It was still kind of growing into itself as a profession. And design in my sort of career history was very much understood as a tool for marketing or driving a business goal, which it can be and should be. But business goals aren't always numbers. They aren't always those kinds of things. Sometimes they're like less hard to pinpoint. But I think I started realizing that inclusive design was not really present in my sphere of understanding and my kind of work, like at the beginning of my career, within like my first year of working at where I was working, just purely from the things that I now realize as like obvious when I look back, like the kinds of people that were working at the company, how homogenous they were, the kinds of ad campaigns that we were doing, which were not actually able to really have conversations about what the overarching cultural impact is of like perpetuating stereotypes or perpetuating just kind of crude jokes for the sake of like the reason that we might think that crude jokes might make a business case for us. And it's kind of, I'm sure that there would have been conversations in boardrooms about like this might get us in trouble, but isn't all attention better
Good
than no
attention.
attention, that kind of stuff.
Mm.
I don't really know about that kind of side of things, but I do know that apart from the kind of design that I was doing early on being very non-helpful design, it was mostly just get people to do this thing that we want them to do. Which is, I think we call this a lot more like recently, like deceptive design, or this deceptive design is also commonly known as dark patterns, but a lot of the
Mm.
community are trying to
Move away from the dark and the white. Yeah.
right.
Yeah. So
We can't get away from it. We keep using it to like, oh, but yeah, deceptive design is the agreed term. But when you say deceptive design to somebody, they often go, and you go dark patterns, but don't call it that anymore. Call it this. And they're like, oh, yeah. But yeah, it was very much like get them to buy this insurance, get them to sign up for this thing, get them to do this without necessarily understanding, which is something that I know now, like whether and why that person needs to do that and why they need to do that and why it's beneficial for them. So it's a lot of very like non-inclusive from like a internal perspective, as well as like a just the face value of the representation being really poor, like terrible representation. But then again, it was a reflection of what was available to us as designers as well. So you can't really fault people to some extent too much, given the barriers that they were facing. And that if you had to use photography, I remember one of my early career like places in Bristol, like it was amazing that they gave us a budget to go do photography on site. It was like truly, I was astounded that they allowed us to like go and do photography. And me and the one other designer in this huge company like made a real well, actually him more than me, which I just, you know, gave him the push that he needed to kind of assert this, but made sure that the people that we were hiring as models for those pieces of photography were not only people that used our service, but that were all the different kinds of people that used our service. But then again, we also were not having conversations about whether like they were being like equitably compensated, given like what, you know, but back then that was,
it wasn't a conversation.
it wasn't a conversation, and we were kind of astounded that we were able to do anything essentially. But that's kind of when I first realized that being inclusive within the design that I was doing was really important. And then I transitioned my career into more of like a human rights focus. And I mean, NGO world and human rights world has its own problems with inclusivity, like truly, and they're complicated and painful and wrapped up with how financial aid works in places.
Hmm.
It would be no surprise for most people to like hear that most NGOs, especially like the US based ones, are predominantly like white, um, like led, and a lot of the barriers to get into that space are huge. But hey,
I always
there is.
say that inclusive marketing, and I think it goes with inclusive design as well, can happen with non-inclusive or diverse teams. And that's the thing that people seem to
Mm,
have this kind of rub against, like, oh no, the team has to be diverse for us to practice. And I'm just like, we'll be waiting a long time for some certain situations. So let's kind of
yeah.
look at the two. It will be better. I think with a diverse team, you will have better inclusive marketing, but you do not
Mm,
need it to start it.
mm. Was it? I don't know who shared this recently, but I saw a video recently about like somebody was asking somebody what percentage of the tech workforce do they think are like Black women, and they
Mm,
said loads of people were saying like, oh, 5%, 1%, 20%, and then I think it ended up being like 0.06%, and people were like, what? And it's like, actually that's kind of not surprising in a lot of ways. But yeah, it's exactly what you say. And I had a conversation this last conference I was at where this conversation comes up a lot, no matter kind of what the subject matter of my talks are, because they're often about like trying to be more inclusive generally, like even if
mhm,
they're not specifically about inclusivity and diversity. But I had a group of people come up to me, and two people were really impacted by the talk, which was talking about like how we design for tools for people that are combating like oppressive governments. And one person is originally from a incredibly oppressive government, currently detaining people and putting people in prison for protesting, and was very like surprised and pleased that somebody was talking about her speciality, like
mhm,
design, within the context of the things that she'd experienced. That was huge for her. And there was another person that was from another country that has a lot of gender-based violence, a lot of, gender inequity. And like she was talking about how she really wants to go back and be able to do more in her country of origin. But there's also this capitalism. I
mm,
am now part of capitalism and I'm earning well. Like, why would I get anyway? It's like, is it a revolutionary act to be like leveraging capitalism for your own like comfort? I would say yes if you're enjoying it. Um, but yeah, there was a person that was, I would say, like presumably white, didn't
mhm.
correct me otherwise, but asked the age-old question. Can you guess what the question is, Joy?
There's too
The
many
what
coming to
can I
mind.
do? What can I do? It's the white person question, or the person that doesn't identify as the thing. Like the what can I do to make things better? And
How can I
like,
be a savior?
right, yeah, it's so tricky because that question will always come up. And as you were saying, I think the answer to that question for white people to tell other white people is go talk to other white people about the problems and like stop like bothering people that are having these problems unless they like there is that ask of you to like bring you into it.
Hmm.
And it was sort of like received really in a like a very confused way. It was like, but you're telling me to go like be with more white people, shouldn't I be with more like people that aren't me? Anyway, I
Sorry.
think she
Oh
anyway.
gosh, that is the answer I imagine in my head sometimes that I don't give. Yes,
Mm,
go do the work yourself and then come back, go do some of that
yeah.
self-education and come back with a well-crafted question that isn't just how can I help? Because that is not
Mm,
helpful.
yeah.
Um, that's so interesting. So in terms of on that line of doing the work themselves,
Mm-hmm.
I find it so fascinating that you mentioned in 2010 that conversation wasn't there because when we did our episode on inclusive design, we were looking back at like the history of where it came about.
Mm,
And the whole genre in itself seemed to originated in like the 80s with architecture.
Oh yeah, yeah,
So
yeah.
I'm just like the crossover, and then I started to think about that. I think you said shared it with me, the Microsoft resource of like
Mm.
all the inclusive things. When did you start using those tools, and what kind of tools do you recommend for people to educate themselves?
Mm. Some of the history is really interesting, like the architecture movement and like the participatory design and participatory action research is like around like the 80s was like when it was beginning, but it was much more like the workers focused.
Mm.
So the I think a lot of that kind of history was like unintentionally inclusive because the people that were the workers, quote unquote, like in the factories,
Hmm.
are going to be the people that are like more marginalized
Mm.
historically.
Hmm.
So I think that the efforts to include the workers in order to increase their efficiency, often like this is whole all about how do we work with the workers to increase their efficiency within like the design systems, not necessarily how to empower them. So it was all about like making them work harder
Getting
and
more out of
faster.
them. Hmm.
Yeah, yeah. And I think architecture was to some extent that maybe as well. I don't know enough about architecture, but anyway, the history is fascinating because the like world of like computer-based design, like HCI, human computer interaction, kind of borrows from a lot of those spaces, the processes, but is historically feels very unaware of its own self. Like it's a very
Mm.
non-self-aware practice. Like what does it mean to use like content design? I don't feel like is something that is more recent as like a person that wants to think about like how the content is structured, how it comes across, all that tone, all that kind of stuff is probably like what, between 5 to 10 years old, I feel. But when did I start using stuff? I started using stuff in a startup company. I was working in a
Mm.
startup company here in Bristol, and I think I was just, I don't know why. I guess at that point I was like, if not in a startup company, then where can you like
True.
try and do something a little bit
Innovative.
different,
Hmm.
innovative, right? Yeah. And so that's when I started trying to better understand like who the users were and discovering like all the things that were non-surprising, that we weren't representing the users that are actually using things in the kinds of design that we were doing. So a lot of our defaults, like for the tools and systems, or a lot of the examples that we had were like based on very archetypal, like versions of what we thought our users were, without giving away the name of I kind of want to be a bit abstract just in case, but that were like very much a product of the two kind of white guy founders, essentially. Like
Mm.
this is what our users look like because they are us, because we are the founders, and therefore we
Hmm.
made this for ourselves. But yeah, I started kind of trying to do more of that kind of work in that startup company, and found that it was like just super awkward. I don't know whether it's like the culture, uh or the space, like the domain, the tech space, because it was like a commercial, like a profit making company. um so I don't know if it was like to do with that side of things, but like certainly there was an undertone of, but will this increase the numbers that we want to increase, not the this is a good thing to do. And I
Hmm.
think that's a tension that comes up in design a lot, which is like, what is the thing that the what is the thing that is good to do for people
Hmm.
versus what is the thing that we want them to do because it benefits the person or the entity that it benefits. And sometimes people don't think that those two things can be this one and the same, right?
Hmm.
um
I was just
that
about to
by
ask that. I was like, do you think they clash, or do you think they're one of the same?
I think they can be one and the same. I don't think that they're always in like harmony. Like certainly things that promote a lot of misinformation and disinformation are always going to be like malicious in a lot of ways. But I think that from my experience doing design, I'm trying to do design inclusively with companies that aren't nonprofit
Mm,
focused, have a harder time and ask more questions about whether doing the thing that is good for the people also meets their goals, like for doing better business. And often the answer is yes. If you better represent these people, if you better include them, they're going to use your thing for longer. They're going to have a better time. They're going to tell other people about it. They're going to tell other people like them about it. It's going to do this. But those are all things that are hard to prove. And they're often
mm,
hard to prove with the design side of things. It's I've always had a lot of tricky situations around like how do you prove that certain design can be easy to track, like it can
mhm.
be easy to like know that a image that is more representative works better and has more people doing the thing that you want them to do than an image that doesn't represent them. That's
Yeah.
reasonably easy to track and measure.
Click in, view times,
Yeah,
bounce
yeah,
rate. Yeah.
for sure. But stuff that is a little bit harder, like say inclusive um titles or inclusive like name fields in profile information,
Okay.
or like anything that is more like editable and more customizable.
Just on the
So
name fields bit, do you
yeah,
mean the bit where they normally would put like John Doe, then the
yeah.
age? Okay.
Yeah, so a lot of this conversation started with like the should we capture gender and how should we capture gender, because gender is a lot more fluid than what we know it to be. There are things like the gender that is expressed on a legal piece of identification that people would companies might want to capture. Um, but then there's like how we identify and how we identify over time as well. So it's not
Hmm.
always like when I sign up for a bank account, my gender might be this, but actually in 5 years' time, it might be something else, which is
Mm.
entirely possible. Same thing with a name, same thing with a
Hmm.
title, like a Ms., Mrs., Mr., Sir type thing. But the return on investment for having very flexible user experience tools, so
Hmm.
ways that customers can use a tool and ways that they want to use a tool as opposed to the way that the tool creators want them to use it,
Hmm.
are very hard to track. So you could sort of say track how many times somebody changes their title or their gender over a period of time. You could sort of track certain things, but you won't necessarily know why until you do things like user testing and user research and find out. For example, some of the things that we used to find out is the more flexible a system is and the more willing a system is to change
Hmm.
different information, the more likely people that do want to change that information will stick around in a service, right? So you've kind
Okay.
of got you've kind of got like some tools that won't ever let you change your username. So I think Spotify is one of the examples
Yep.
where, yeah. So it's very strange that if you create a username, which is a name that you used to use and you don't use that name anymore, you have to exit the service and re-enter the anyway. So
It's tricky on that one for me because my marketing brain is like, yes, we can customize it to who the person wants to be now and market to them.
mhm.
But my data scientist brain is like trying to map all of that in the back end.
Yeah. So this is often the thing that it's like, is the inclusivity of the design worth more than the effort for technical
Mm,
build and complexity? And often, like this is an age-old thing between design and development, is that we often are in conflict, design and development, because the design and designing inclusively is about relevancy, flexibility, understanding people and what they want to do. And those kinds of things are hard to program, like
mm.
complete flexibility, complete like relevancy within like the rules of some certain systems. So yeah, absolutely. I've definitely had the conversations with developers and other people like, But if we have a free text field, we won't be able to, like, do these other things, which is valid because they might actually be like critical errors that might not be able to be like, imagine if it was your bank account, right? And if you
Hmm.
couldn't map the data of your name to the bank account, then you won't be able to withdraw money, which is arguably worse than the flexibility of the system. But
But a
yeah,
lot of
it's
the things, in regards to like gender, age, titles and stuff, a lot of it is just for reporting. And
yeah.
someone looks at that report once or twice a year.
Mm,
One thing you mentioned though, and I've always pondered on this one, and it might be the naivety. I have data science background, but not development.
mm-hmm,
Um, the titles bit, the Mr. Mr. Mrs.
mm-hmm,
I was just like, why don't we just simply apply the logic we've had with Miss, Mrs. to the
mm,
other things that are now becoming multiples?
mm-hmm,
I don't understand why it's become such a complexity thing when we've had a
mm,
version of it in forms for such a long time.
mm-hmm.
So if we are able to address that women have titles can change, their
Yeah,
Mrs. can change, why can't we
yeah.
one apply that for men as well? Two, apply that in gender and apply that in
Mm.
name if we can easily map it there.
Well, easily is an interesting way of saying it. Like, so as a person that's gone through like multiple name changes, it is not a simple process. It's well, in the UK anyway, it's not a simple process. It's a process of actual physical documents being sent to places sometimes, like, especially if it's critical information like banks. Like, so they will require things like copies of marriage certificates, along with like birth certificates and things like that. Um, so it's possible, but it's
Mm,
not. I think the way of saying it is possible, but it's not ideal for the company because it's time and time is money, right? And it's all about like, I feel like often the conversation that is often unspoken as well, because it's a kind of phrase that any company doesn't want to say out loud, right? Which is what's the what's the benefit to us
mhm,
as a company to change your name? There isn't really, like, keeping you as business, great,
mhm,
like, but what is that worth to us? Like, are you worth it to us? And there's kind of like some of that it gets applied to the design process often, and a lot of the challenges of being a designer, like, generally is like, how far can you push a certain kind of inclusive design or user-centered design or any kind of centered design that isn't necessarily, I guess, like pure business goals centered design, but how far can you take it to a user-centered level whilst also knowing that the business or the company or the organization will say, yes, we can do that.
mm.
Because it's always a balancing act of like, we want to be able to have users be able to do this, and this. And then it's like, well, it's more, we need them to be able to do this. We don't need them to be able to do that. So what's the benefit to us as an organization company? And
It's
often
so
designers really
fascinating.
struggle. Designers
Yeah.
really struggle to articulate that. It's not something we get taught. Um, yeah, it's hard.
I think it goes back to what you originally said about design in itself not being that open of a thing,
Mm,
because if I'm not saying that I would be the ideal boss or whatever, but because I have that marketing perspective, there are some elements that I'm thinking like that first. I'm thinking
mm-hmm,
user first, I'm thinking experience first, not necessarily business first, because I know long term, the longer we have the customer, the better.
yeah.
For me, that's the overall end goal.
Mm-hmm,
But with design not being transparent, you're having a lot of leaders still looking at it the same way I did when I first came in, like, oh, it's just graphics, or oh, it's just this, and not
mm-hmm,
applying how much that you've emphasized how much the user is involved, how much it's human centric. And
mm.
all of that then leads to longevity, which then leads to return on investment.
Yeah, yeah. It's such a complicated, like, it's definitely a more complicated career or like uh practice or craft or however you want to call design than people sort of often initially think. It's very much grounded in a lot of hypothesis, grounded in a lot of like balancing between different competing factors, especially like if you're practicing the kind of design which is like, again, inclusive or like aware. So you're
Mhm.
not the kind of designer which is like just phoning it in and kind of just doing whatever you're kind of told, that you're actually kind of engaging with the understanding of the subject matter. Um, but yeah, often the people that make some of the best designers are people that don't come from a design education background, that come from any kind of other educational background. I think that it's a lot better now, but I remember when we were first talking about like the tech sector, and there was a lot of like there's a lot of conversation about like a tech education or like a design education as well. And I don't necessarily think that the things that I think the things that you learn in any kind of environment can be applicable to being good designers.
Mm.
Um, but the gatekeepers would argue differently.
Oh, there's gatekeepers. There's annoying,
Mm-hmm.
annoying gatekeepers. No, this has been absolutely fascinating. I already have so many more questions, but I'm
Mm-hmm.
mindful that I want to get to one of our fave sections of the
Mm-hmm.
podcast. So we are a marketing podcast through and through. So we do lean into the capitalism every now and again because sometimes we like to buy things. Now, I may make it niche, but feel free to choose any other area.
Mm-hmm.
Say there was a maybe a Dungeons and Dragons campaign,
Yeah.
and they were trying to encourage you to be their customer, not that you.
Ooh.
How would you imagine that campaign? And it can be a video, it can be how, like, what would you envision the Dungeons and Dragon campaign that would connect with you the most?
Oh, Joyann, this could be a whole nother episode of a podcast. The marketing of Dungeons and Dragons games is a fascinating domain. They've just gone like monetized recently in the last few
Mhm,
years. Like, so you've always been able to pay to join games, or that it historically has been very much like people run it for free for friends and things like that. But people run games from like you pay to participate in that game now. And there's a really interesting person on I think she's still on Twitter, called It's Friday, her Twitter handle, but
mhm.
she does a whole podcast called Dungeons and Dollars, which is how to market yourself as like a paid dungeon master. It's fascinating stuff. You'll love it. Um,
Yes.
but like she talks about like, okay, so the image that you use for your thumbnail, it has to be a face that has direct eye contact with the user so that they feel like they're immersed in the game. So can't be a character that's looking off into the distance unless it's a campaign that is about like adventure, and it's all about the context. And then the use of emojis, and so there's a whole thing to do with character limit as well, which is
Mhm,
like the title. You must know like tons about character limit, like and how to optimize character limit. But like you've got like this title to get people to purchase your in buy into your game.
mhm.
You've got like about the size of like 25 words with emojis. Maybe
That's a
that.
decent amount.
Yeah, I think it might be even less, but like you have to, in that title, you have to say what kind of game it is, what kind of person you are that runs the game, who you'd like to encourage into that game. So a lot of people use like the pride flag to be like
Mm.
more inclusive for LGBT players. Um, Other people use different kinds of emojis or different kinds of words like POC, inclusive, that kind of thing. Um, but okay, so if something was marketed towards me specifically, how I would want it to be marketed, because I went into the generals of marketing
You got
games there.
excited. I love it.
Oh, it's so excited. It's fascinating. It's such a fascinating because it's a when something's new and it's like yummy because it's all like discovering how it works. Um, I think I would want, and I have been like susceptible to this kind of marketing before. Essentially, Dungeons and Dragons is selling an experience and a community vibe.
Hmm.
So the thing that I want my marketing for me, it's not for everybody, but most people are in it to hang out with a group of people, whether they know them before or they're new people that they're meeting. What I want the marketing to be is I want it to not just be about the content of the game, but I want it to be about those people as well. So what I'd love to see more in the Dungeons and Dragons campaign, specifically the campaign marketing, is like more emphasis on who are the people that I'm going to be sharing my time with and what motivates them as like characters or players. Because I'm not just engaging in a transaction with this person running the game, the Dungeons and Dragons game. I'm engaging with like 4 or 5 other people who have their own goals, their own aspirations, and like I want to know a bit about that as well.
What level of detail? Like, do you want their names and like,
I mostly want to know. Oh, this is such a weird word to answer you to. I want their vibes, essentially. I know that that's
okay,
like the worst kind of word to answer, but I want whatever is their vibe to come across. Like, so it can be visual or it can be like text based, but I want to get like a sense of who they are from like a snapshot.
all right, I'm seeing it. Okay, 1 minute video,
Uh-huh.
obviously a non-skippable YouTube ad because we need to see the whole
Mm,
video.
mm,
Um, First shot is three-way split screen of
mm,
each character sat
mm,
in their space. I'm
mm.
kind of basing it what I'm looking at right now. If you're not on YouTube, you need to hop on YouTube and see how amazing Errol's space is. Um, but they sat in their space and then you're just seeing them kind of like smiling and moving. Like they're going somewhere, but you can get a sense of their background. One has like a super earthy browns. You see like a what do you call it? A dream catcher in the background.
Mm-hmm.
Another one is like all clean and cut lines, and there's like just weapons, but weapons that are mounted. So you can see
Mm,
their display.
mm-hmm.
Um, so I'm trying to think of the different types of characters. Earthy, weapons, and maybe a magical vibe. So
Mm-hmm.
you're not really seeing anything, but you're getting a glimpse of like glitter and smoke and
Mm-hmm.
there's just shimmer.
Yeah.
And then it cuts and then someone starts voicing over and it starts the campaign. And then you like speed through it.
Yeah. Yeah, or if you aren't already bought into it, like just before that person like launches into the campaign, there's like, a image of like a mirror and it's you, like a silhouette in a
Uh,
mirror. Do you know what I mean? You
mhm.
know, because it's about like participating in that fantasy. So there has to be a way that you, without like knowing who that person is, there has to be a way of like that person going, oh, I could fit in there. It's like,
How integrated do you like your marketing? Because there's two issues with
mm,
this idea I'm about to pitch. There's a data privacy issue and access and all that jazz. But say they could turn your camera on and put you
mm-hmm,
in the ad,
mm-hmm.
and then you just look and then you're in the ad, you're next to those three characters.
I'm very aware of like privacy and stuff like that, but I am susceptible to like things that I enjoy. I would be like stoked to just have like a little face of me on like a little illustration of a character and be like, this could be you, like thing. Um, that would be really cool for like immersion.
Mm,
Um, but yeah,
okay.
anything that brings you into the fantasy
I love
is gonna
it.
be good.
I love it because then that is just vibes. There's no it's so fascinating because when we've done this with other guests, they're kind of like defining characteristics about the people.
Hmm.
But it sounds like yours is just experience, community, connection, and everything else
Yeah,
is up for
yeah.
the shuffle.
Yeah. There doesn't need to be like a specific like kind of way of saying the message that's inclusive. It's like it's a weird domain to try and market, but it's fascinating. But yeah, it's mostly just about, can I see myself there with those people doing what they're doing, and anything that gets that sense over and helps me to feel like, yeah, I can do that. is gonna have me like click, buy right now, sign up right now, 4 hours of my one of my evenings a week. Do you
Just
know what I
gone.
mean? Like
Hmm.
straight up, I have played like 50 to 60 sessions with like pro DMs, which is like no joke. I'm just gonna be full transparent here. DMs charge from like $15 a session to about 40 or $50 a session. It's they can make coin on like these things.
Okay. Dungeons and
Don't do the
Dragons
math.
marketing. I'm
Please
going
don't
to
do the math of how much I've spent on Dungeons and Dragons. Somebody will do the math.
Oh my gosh. No, I love it. I
Mm.
absolutely because I was going one of two options, either Dungeons and Dragons or Sailor Moon, but I feel like trying to make Sailor Moon inclusive is a harder feat. Like it's just one of those
Yeah.
ones where you just kind of have to leave it alone because
Yeah.
it is what it was and it, you know.
Well, so with Sailor Moon, I think that one feels simpler in the thing that I love the most about modern Sailor Moon is all the cosplayers that are non like white
Um,
cosplayers. Like
yeah.
they do such amazing costumes for like the Sailor Moon characters. I want a full series of just those cosplayers like doing their Sailor Moon like stuff.
Some
That's
user
what I
generated
want.
content. Okay, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, you spun it. I like that.
Yeah.
Okay. Got two
Yeah.
campaigns there. Um,
Yeah.
let our listeners and viewers know where they can find you on the internet.
Oh gosh, I'm still on the what's the word that people are using it? Not health, I guess. Depending on your view, I'm still on the Twitter or whatever the it is
Oh
called now,
gosh.
X. For as long as it I makes sense to be there, I'm at Errol Does Design there. But you can also find me on Mastodon. Mastodon, you can also go on my Twitter profile to find my Hachyderm URL, which is again just hachyderm .io, I think, /Errol Does Design. So you can find me on Mastodon there. But those are probably the best places to find me online nowadays. If you want to see talks, you can find them on YouTube if you just search for Owl Fox.
Yeah, amazing talks and goes way back, way, way
It does go
back.
way back.
Thank you so much for joining me, Errol. It's been a pleasure having you on the Marketing Made Inclusive podcast. And thank you so much to our listeners for tuning in. Let us know your thoughts on the episode in the comments, or you can leave us a review. We'd love to hear from you. Have an amazing, amazing week whenever you're listening to this.